Do you ever wondered why a simple Christmas in the 1960s makes so many people pause or even tear up when they remember it? It's not because we had more back then. It's because we had enough. A small, warm room, an old television the whole family gathered around, and a few gifts waited for all year long. There was no noise. There was no rush. Just family, anticipation, and a feeling that is so hard to find today. Christmas in the 60s, not rich, but complete. Christmas in the 1960s America was not the dazzling shopping-filled holiday we see today. Back then, there were no packed malls starting in October, no endless lists of gifts, and no pressure to buy everything. Christmas was much simpler. But that very simplicity made everything feel complete in its own way. Most American families in the 60s were middle class. Dad went to work every day, and Mom often stayed home to take care of the family. Life wasn't lavish, but it was stable. Money was used for necessities, not for showing off. And because of that, Christmas didn't carry the stress of needing to be extravagant. It just needed to be warm enough, fun enough, and enough to keep the whole family together. Back then, Christmas hadn't been swept up in the consumer whirlwind. You weren't bombarded with gift advertisements day and night. Kids weren't attacked by hundreds of new toys every holiday season. Instead, they waited. They waited day after day, week after week, from Thanksgiving right up until Christmas morning. It was that very anticipation that made December 25th so incredibly special. In many families, Christmas wasn't about having it all, but about realizing you already had enough. Enough food on the table, enough warmth in the living room, enough laughter ringing out around the dinner table, enough moments together that a busy year rarely allowed. A TV set in the living room, an old sofa, a tree standing quietly in the corner. That was all it took for Christmas to be present. No one felt deprived because every family was similar. The neighbors next door ate dinner around a similar table. Their kids also hoped for just a few small presents. There was no comparison, no feeling of being left behind. Christmas was a communal experience, and everyone was living life at the same pace. That created a feeling of completeness that is hard to describe. Not because we had more, but because no one demanded more. When everything was just right, every small moment became precious. An evening spent sitting together as a family. A television show that everyone watched. A meal that wasn't fancy, but was warm. Christmas in the 60s was like that. Not extravagant, but complete. And sometimes enough is exactly what we remember most when we look back. The childhood bedroom and the feeling of anticipation. For American children in the 1960s, Christmas didn't start in the living room, nor did it begin under the tree. It started in the bedroom, a small, quiet room where kids woke up earlier than any other day of the year, with hearts beating faster than the alarm clock. Christmas morning was often very quiet back then. No traffic noise outside, no loud sounds, just the faint winter light filtering through the curtains and a gentle chill in the air. The bedroom wasn't freezing, but cool enough to make you pull the blankets closer. Thick pajamas, wool socks, and the robe hanging ready at the foot of the bed, all familiar parts of that morning. Kids woke up early, but they weren't always allowed to rush downstairs right away. There was an unwritten rule in many households. You had to wait for Mom and Dad to wake up, or at least until you heard sounds from the kitchen. That very waiting is what made Christmas unforgettable. You lay still in bed, eyes wide open, listening for the smallest sound in the house, the creak of the floorboards, the soft opening of a bedroom door, the sound of the stove being lit downstairs. In those moments, a child's imagination ran wilder than ever. What was waiting for me under the tree? Was the gift I had thought about for months actually there, or just a small item carefully wrapped in colored paper? That uncertainty made you both anxious and intensely appreciative of every second you waited. There were no phones, no screens to pass the time, just you, the quiet room, and a pure feeling of longing that rarely exists today. It was a feeling that only showed up once a year. A feeling that made time seem to slow down, making every minute longer than normal. When you were finally allowed to leave the bed, that moment felt like a launch. Kids quickly threw on their robes, slipped into slippers, and opened the bedroom door with an almost ceremonial sense. The hallway was still dark. The stairs were still cold, but everything led to the same place, the living room. And in that moment, you knew Christmas had truly begun. The living room, the heart of the home. If the bedroom was where Christmas began with anticipation, the living room is where all the emotions erupted. In American homes of the 1960s, the living room was the family center, where the most important things happened. And on Christmas morning, it truly became the heart of the house. Stepping downstairs, you could immediately feel the difference. The air downstairs was a bit warmer. Not the easy, comfortable warmth of today, but a genuine, honest heat. Maybe from the fireplace crackling in the corner. Perhaps from a small space heater against the wall. Either way, it was the place the whole family naturally gravitated towards, as if led by the warmth itself. Dad was usually up first. He sat near the fireplace, adjusting a log or holding a hot cup of coffee. Not many words were needed. His presence alone was enough to make the room feel safe. Mom was often in the kitchen, occasionally stepping out into the living room, looking at the tree, looking at the children, then returning to her tasks. Christmas began very quietly like that. The living room wasn't large or fancy. A sofa, a couple of armchairs, the coffee table in the middle, a television set against the wall, usually a big box TV with short legs and a slightly curved screen. But it was in that simple space that the whole family gathered. No one was in a private room. No one was separated. Everyone was there in the same room, sharing the same moment. The tree stood in the corner, not too tall, but enough to capture everyone's attention. Underneath, the gifts were neatly stacked, untouched. There was a very special sense of reverence for this moment. Not because of strict rules, but because everyone understood. Take your time. Just let Christmas unfold at its own pace. The living room was where the first laughter of the day rang out. It was where the children sat on the floor, their eyes glued to the wrapped presents. It was where the adults chatted, sipped coffee, and occasionally smiled, seeing the genuine joy on the children's faces. In that moment, no one thought about work, bills, or worries outside. Everything seemed to be set aside behind the closed door. Did your childhood Christmas happen in the living room, the kitchen, or by the tree? Share your memory in the comments below. The Christmas tree and decorations. A handmade Christmas in American homes of the 1960s. The Christmas tree wasn't the flawless decoration you saw in advertisements. It didn't need to be tall, and it certainly didn't need to be perfectly symmetrical. The most important thing was it was there in the house, and the whole family put it up together. Many families bought real trees from roadside lots or local markets. Those trees carried a very distinctive pine scent, fresh yet slightly sharp, enough to make the entire room smell like Christmas as soon as you walked in. Other families used artificial trees brought out of the garage or basement once a year, with slightly bent branches and a color that wasn't exactly vibrant green anymore. But whether it was real or fake, it carried the same meaning. Christmas had arrived. Decorating the tree was a family ritual. No one did it alone. Dad set up the base and made sure it stood steady. Mom opened the old boxes of ornaments, handling them carefully as if opening a box of memories. The children were the most eager, because every single decoration was attached to a story. Fragile glass balls, some chipped, some that had existed since Mom and Dad were children. The handmade crafts you brought home from school, made of colored paper, tinsel, and lots of glue. Christmas lights were usually the multicolored string kind, and not every bulb worked perfectly. Before hanging them, the whole family had to test the strings. Sometimes a bulb needed replacing. Sometimes it just needed a tighter twist. When they were finally plugged in and the whole string lit up, the room completely transformed. The light wasn't glaring, but warm. It made everything softer, even the most ordinary corners of the room. Besides the tree, decorations appeared throughout the house. A wreath hung on the front door. Tinsel draped across the mantelpiece. Paper chains or strings of popcorn, strung by the kids, hung along the hallway. There was no color scheme or style uniformity. Everything was a little bit different. But that very charming clutter created the genuine feeling of Christmas. The most special thing was that no one thought about making it look good for others. There was no social media, no photos taken to show off the house. Everything was decorated for the family itself, for the people who would sit in that room throughout the holiday season. And because of that, every item, no matter how simple, held its own unique value. Christmas television, all of America watching together. In the 1960s, Christmas television was a shared experience for the entire country. When the TV set was turned on in the living room, you weren't just watching a show. You were sharing the exact same moment, the same story, the same feeling with millions of other families across the states. Back then, options were few. There were only 3 major networks: ABC, CBS, and NBC. No remote controls, no recording, no catch-up viewing. If you missed a show, it was gone. Because of this, Christmas television held a special value. It compelled the entire family to sit down together on time in the same room. The TV didn't just instantly turn on. You had to wait. The screen slowly brightened. The familiar hum came on. The image was fuzzy at first, then gradually sharpened. Kids sat close to the screen. Adults sat on the sofa, and everyone knew this is when Christmas truly begins. Those shows became the shared memory of a generation. A Charlie Brown Christmas first aired in 1965. It was a lesson on the true meaning of Christmas told with slow voices, gentle music, and a rare sincerity. Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, Frosty the Snowman, and the special Disney Sunday night features all were anticipated, not because they were new, but because they brought a feeling of familiarity and security. The whole family watched together. No one was multitasking. There were no separate screens for each person. Kids might laugh, adults might be silent, but everyone was there in the same room, sharing the same moment. And outside, millions of other families were doing the exact same thing. The most remarkable feeling was knowing that the whole country was watching the same thing. The next day, at school or at work, everyone talked about the same program. There was no need to ask, "Did you watch it?" Because everyone had. Christmas television created an invisible thread connecting people who had never met. Today, we have endless choices. But because of that, that shared experience has vanished. The 60s Christmas was different. When the TV was turned on in the living room, it wasn't just entertainment. It was a moment when the whole family gathered and an entire nation breathed in unison. What Christmas TV show did your family watch together in the 60s? Share your memories so we can see if we share the same past. Christmas lunch, a warm kitchen, and laughter. As the morning television programs concluded, Christmas in the 1960s, America shifted to a different rhythm, slower, warmer, and focused entirely on the kitchen. Christmas lunch was not a rushed meal. It was the result of hours of preparation, patience, and a lot of love. In homes back then, Mom was usually in the kitchen very early. No modern ovens or complex recipes, just a large turkey, carefully placed in the oven and checked constantly. Mom would open the oven door, peek in, and sigh softly, as if wondering if it was soft enough, cooked enough, and Christmas-flavored enough. It was a very familiar worry, repeated year after year. The smell of food filled the house. Melted butter, roasted meat, steaming stuffing. On the counter were large bowls of mashed potatoes, green bean casserole, and carefully mixed gravy. Next to them was the can of cranberry sauce, opened and still retaining its cylindrical shape when scooped onto the plate. A small detail, but so familiar that it was essential. Kids loitered around the kitchen, eager and hungry. They asked for a cookie, a spoonful of potatoes, or simply stood watching, waiting until they were called to the table. The adults chatted, sometimes laughing loudly, sometimes exchanging just a few short sentences. No one rushed. Christmas allowed everything to slow down. When it was time to eat, the whole family sat around the table. It wasn't always a huge crowd, but it always felt complete. The dining table didn't need to be perfect. A tablecloth might have been old. The dishes might not have matched, but everyone was there, sharing a meal that only happened once a year. The clinking of silverware on plates. The slight scrape of chairs being pulled across the floor. The sound of laughter when someone recounted an old story. Christmas lunch in the 60s didn't need to be loud to be memorable. It was memorable because it was the moment the family truly sat down together, undistracted by anything else. Dessert, the sweetness of the era. After Christmas lunch, when the large plates were cleared and the conversation quieted down, the kitchen entered its own special moment. It was time for dessert. Quietly, without fanfare, but enough to calm the whole house. 1960s Christmas dessert was the sweet reward after a long morning of anticipation and a filling lunch. Familiar pies were brought to the counter. Pumpkin pie, apple pie, sometimes pecan pie, placed on large platters cut into even slices. No elaborate decoration was needed. A dollop of whipped cream or a spoonful of vanilla ice cream on top was enough. For children, this was a highly anticipated moment. Not because pie was rare, but because it was only at Christmas that they got to eat it this way. In another corner of the table, there might be a colorful Jell-O mold, red, green, yellow. It wobbled slightly whenever someone touched it. For adults, it might not have been their favorite dessert, but for children, it held a special appeal. It was cheerful, cool, and completely tied to the Christmas memories of that era. More coffee was poured for the adults. Old porcelain mugs, perhaps slightly chipped at the rim, but used year after year. Children were given milk or hot cocoa, held carefully with both hands to keep warm. The family wasn't sitting formally anymore, like during the main meal. Whoever wanted to stand stood. Whoever wanted to stay at the table stayed. The atmosphere became more relaxed. This was also the time when small stories began to emerge. One person recalled last Christmas. Another told a story from their own childhood. The stories didn't need to be grand. They were just small fragments of memory pieced together during a slow afternoon. Christmas gifts, toys that lasted a childhood. Finally, the moment every child had been waiting for arrived. After lunch, after dessert, when the house had quieted down and the feeling of rush was gone, the whole family gathered back in the living room. Under the tree, the gifts were still there, carefully wrapped, as if they had waited patiently all morning for their exact moment. Christmas in the 1960s was not a day of mountains of gifts. There was no scene of wrapping paper covering the entire room after just a few minutes. Each child usually only had a few presents, and among them, there was always one that was the most special. The gift you had thought about for months. The gift you only dared to mention a few times during the year, because you knew it wasn't cheap, and you couldn't always have it. When that wrapped present was placed in your hands, everything around seemed to slow down. You carefully peeled back layer after layer of paper, not because you were taught to save it, but because you didn't want the moment to pass too quickly. And when the item was revealed, the feeling was almost indescribable. Maybe it was a brand new Barbie doll with the outfit you had seen in the store for so long. Maybe it was a G.I. Joe set, ready for imaginary adventures that lasted all year. For some families, it was the Lionel train set, carefully arranged on the floor, running around the tree to the amazement of both adults and children. For others, it was an easy bake oven, an etch-sketch, Lincoln Logs, or one of the first Hot Wheels cars that appeared late in the decade. These items weren't disposable toys. They became part of childhood. You played with them after Christmas. You played with them all winter. You brought them out in the summer. And by the next year, they were still there, carefully stored, perhaps with a few scratches, but still full of value. Adults sat on the sofa watching, smiling. They didn't need to constantly film videos or take pictures. They just watched. Watched the genuine joy on the children's faces. Watched the moment when a year of hard work seemed to be repaid by a peaceful afternoon. Today, children may receive many gifts, but sometimes they remember very few. The 60s Christmas was different. You might not remember everything you were given, but you always remember that special gift. The gift you held tightly while falling asleep that night. The gift that years later, just thinking about it, still makes your heart feel warm. Do you still remember the 1960s Christmas gift you cherished most? Tell us about it so everyone can remember that moment. The afternoon when Christmas slows down, when the gifts were all opened and the initial excitement had subsided, Christmas in 1960s America entered a very special period. It was the afternoon when everything slowed down naturally, without anyone needing to be told. There was no more anticipation or nervousness. Only peacefulness remained. Children began playing with their new toys right there on the living room floor. No need to tidy up. Lego pieces, Lincoln logs, small cars pushed back and forth across the rug. Some were so focused they forgot the time. Others leaned back on the floor, hugging their gifts as if afraid they might disappear. No one rushed them. No one told them how to play correctly. Adults sat back on the sofa or armchairs. Dad might be getting sleepy, closing his eyes for a brief moment before opening them again at the sound of the children's laughter. Mom sat nearby, holding a cool cup of coffee or just watching the room with a quiet satisfaction. It didn't need to be said, but everyone felt it. Today was unfolding exactly as it should. The television was turned back on. This time, not for a special program, but just as familiar background noise. Maybe an old movie they had seen many times. Maybe a show no one was really paying attention to. But it didn't matter. The important thing was that the whole family was still there in the same space. Each doing a small thing, but still connected in a very natural way. The 60s Christmas afternoon had no tight schedule. No one was rushing anywhere. The front door was closed. It might be cold outside, but inside was a different world. Quiet, safe, and familiar. Occasionally, there was the sound of a neighbor's doorbell, dropping by to wish them well. Occasionally, someone stood up to make more coffee or bring out leftover pie from lunch. That was the time when memories were often formed, even if no one realized it then. Not from grand moments, but from the very ordinary. From sitting next to each other without needing to talk much. From sharing the same space, the same afternoon, with no other goal than simply being together. Neighbors and community when America felt close. Christmas in the 1960s, America didn't just happen within the four walls of a house. It spilled out onto the porch, onto the front walk, and touched every home in the neighborhood. Back then, neighbors weren't strangers living next door. They knew each other's names. They greeted each other every day. And at Christmas, that connection became clearer than ever. On Christmas afternoon, as the winter sun softened, many families opened their front doors. Not to go far, but to step out onto the porch, breathe the crisp, cold air, and share a very familiar greeting. Merry Christmas. Kids ran up and down the sidewalk, showing off their new gifts. Adults stood nearby, exchanging a few short words, asking about family and the year gone by. In those neighborhoods, there were always a few people living alone. Perhaps an elderly widow, a retired gentleman, or a couple whose children had moved away. And Christmas was the time they weren't forgotten. Someone would knock on the door, bringing a plate of food, a pie, or simply an invitation to come over for tea. No prior planning was needed, no ceremony. It was simply what people felt they should do. The small neighborhood shops were also part of that scene. Maybe the corner store was open for a few hours in the morning. Perhaps the paper boy still made his rounds, tossing the paper onto the porch as usual. These seemingly ordinary things contributed to a feeling of stability and familiarity. The most memorable things weren't the grand gestures, but the small ones. A wave from afar, a greeting called over the fence, a laugh when someone slightly slipped on an icy patch of sidewalk. These moments bonded people together naturally and without pretension. Today, many people live side by side, but rarely truly know each other. But in the 1960s Christmas, community was a very real part of life. People didn't just share space. They shared responsibility, concern, and a sense of belonging to the same place. The evening, tree lights, and peace. As darkness began to fall, Christmas in the 1960s seemed to settle down in a very natural way. No one needed to be reminded. No schedule was necessary. The outside light faded, and the house once again became the center of everything. Christmas evening wasn't noisy. It was quiet, warm, and carried a feeling that is hard to put into words. The living room was no longer bustling like it was in the morning. The children were tired after a long day. A few were still playing with their new gifts, but slower, more quietly. One might be sitting on the floor, gently rolling a toy car. Another might be leaning back on the sofa, eyes vaguely watching the tree. The joy hadn't disappeared. It had just settled. The Christmas tree lights were the centerpiece of the room. Small, multicolored bulbs flickered softly, reflecting on the glass ornaments. That light wasn't bright enough to illuminate the whole room, but it was enough to create a very specific atmosphere. A kind of light that only appeared during this time of year. The television was still on, but the volume was low. Maybe an old movie everyone had seen many times. Maybe a show no one was truly watching. But the sound from the screen became a familiar background noise, like an old friend sitting in the room. No one needed to pay full attention. It just needed to be there. Adults sat more still. Dad might be leaning back in his armchair, eyes closed for a brief moment. Mom sat nearby, holding a magazine or simply looking at the room. There was a very quiet contentment in her eyes. Not because everything was perfect, but because everything was exactly where it belonged. Outside, the cold returned clearly. The windows began to fog up, but inside the house retained its warmth, not just from the fireplace or heater, but from the very presence of the people within it. The whole family was in one place, sharing an evening that required nothing special to be done. The 60s Christmas evening had no climax. It didn't try to impress, but that very peacefulness made it memorable. It was the moment you felt most clearly that you were home, that you were safe, that everything, at least for tonight, was all right. And years later, when thinking back on those Christmases, very few people remember every gift or every TV show. But many remember this evening. They remember the tree lights. They remember the quiet room. They remember the feeling of sitting there without needing to say a word, and knowing they were exactly where they belonged. If you could go back to one moment of your childhood Christmas, would you choose the morning, the lunch, or the quiet evening by the tree? Back to the bedroom, Christmas comes to a close. As the evening gradually passed and the house grew quieter, Christmas in the 1960s entered the final moment of the day. There was no chime marking bedtime, no hurried reminders, just the pleasant exhaustion after a long day, and the familiar silence enveloping the house. Children were called up to bed. No running, no excitement like in the morning. They trudged up the stairs, still clutching their favorite new gift. One carried a doll. One dragged a small car. One carefully placed the new item right next to the pillow, as if afraid the magic might vanish if they took their eyes off it. The bedroom returned to its original simplicity. Yellow lamplight walls with old posters or drawings from school. No flashing lights, no loud sounds. Just the slight cold of the winter night and the familiar blanket covering them. Kids climbed into bed, sometimes still in their day clothes, too tired to change, or because they wanted to hold on to the feeling of Christmas just a little longer. Outside, the house slowly fell asleep. The television in the living room was off. The tree lights were still on, casting a faint glow onto the ceiling. The adults' voices grew softer and stopped entirely. Mom and Dad checked the doors, turned off a few lights, and quietly walked up the stairs. Christmas didn't end with a grand moment. It ended with silence. Lying in bed, children looked up at the ceiling, thinking about the day that had just passed. Not specific details, but the overall feeling. The feeling of being loved, of being home, of being part of the family. That was a feeling that no gift could replace. And in the 1960s, that feeling came very naturally, without needing to be named. Tomorrow would still be Christmas Day. There would still be leftovers. There would still be shows on TV. But this moment, the moment of lying still in the bedroom, hugging a new gift, listening to the silence of the whole house, only happened once. And because of that, it became a memory. Christmas closed like that. Not loudly, not showy, just one complete day. Lived exactly at its own rhythm, then gently drifting into the night. And years later, when we think back on those Christmases, that memory still returns not as a clear image, but as a very familiar feeling. The feeling of a Christmas that was complete and kept deep in the heart. The Christmas of the 1960s didn't need much to be memorable. Just family, time, and shared moments. Perhaps that is what we miss the most today. If you lived through those Christmas seasons, tell us your story in the comments below. And if you love these memories, subscribe to help Back to Yesterday preserve them.